sailing fleet. What could be more romantic? Ancient caravels sailing toward the distant horizon, fierce boarding battles in clouds of gunpowder, mysterious islands where fabulous treasures are hidden. Who didn't read Stevenson and Sabatini's books as a child, dreaming of being like the sailors of the past, fearless and daring? All of this, of course, looks beautiful and noble, but there's one problem. This picture has very little to do with reality. In reality, the life of a sailor in the age of sail was hard, full of hardships and dangers. Moreover, the greatest threats were not storms or pirate bullets, but the lack of hygiene, proper food and medicine. For almost any offense, a sailor was severely punished, and his only comfort during months-long voyages was strong alcohol, which was always included in the sailor's diet. In this episode, I'll tell you what life was really like for sailors in the age of sail, where they slept, what they ate, how they were treated, and how they spent their free time. Why did Winston Churchill, when he heard about the glorious traditions of the British Navy, exclaim, "Don't tell me about them. Naval traditions are rum, the lash, and sodomy"? And in addition, you'll find out why sailors salted lemons, what hardtack is, and why they ate dead Frenchmen. My name is Simon, and I declare the How Did They Live the section open. Let's begin. The sea loves the strong. Even today, in the era of steel ships, radio communication and satellite navigation, seafaring is a tough and dangerous occupation. And now imagine what it was like for sailors in ancient times, setting out on long journeys in fragile wooden boats. Lacking communication, navigational tools, or maps, any voyage could have been their last. The ancient Greeks thought people were either living, dead, or at sea, since sailors were always close to death. Only the ship's thin hull separated them. Sailors of antiquity and the Middle Ages avoided venturing far from familiar shores. This type of sailing is called cabotage. It was safe and convenient. In case of a storm, you could always take shelter in a secure bay, rest, get fresh water on shore, buy food, or go hunting. The situation changed when Europeans dared to cross the oceans. Now sailors had to spend months on board and cross vast distances. They had to rely only on the ship's supplies. Just imagine what that looked like. Hundreds of strong men squeezed into a small wooden box by Maya Sertsami, confined in a cramped, limited space. There was stench and high humidity everywhere. The monotonous food was sickening, and the water had gone bad. Seeing the same faces repeatedly makes you want to howl with boredom. Add to that the exhausting and dangerous work and the diseases that wipe out sailors by the dozens. It's no wonder that often they arrived at their destination port with a crew reduced by half or even more. For instance, of the 170 men who left for India with Vasco da Gama, just 55 survived. And from Magellan's first circumnavigation, only 40% of the sailors made it back home. Food on the fleet was one of the main problems for sailors during the age of sail. They didn't really know how to preserve food yet, so the sailors' diet in the past was poor and monotonous. It mainly consisted of hardtack, salted meat, and dried or cured fish. They were hard to bite even for a healthy person, let alone a sailor weakened by scurvy. The hardtack was crushed in mortars, spices, salt or sugar, beans and peas were added. Then the mixture was poured with water until it reached a paste-like consistency. This dish tasted so terrible that it was called dog cake. It should be added that the hardtack quickly became moldy and infested with worms, so people tried to eat it in the dark so they wouldn't see the disgusting insects. The problem was only solved after the advent of steel ships, which could accommodate proper bakeries. Salted meat deserves a special mention. It was terrible meat that would go bad after just a few months. It smelled so disgusting that English sailors called salted meat dead Frenchmen. Similar appetites existed on other fleets as well, but it was salted meat that formed the basis of what was called lunch on sailing ships. Sailors also had their own delicacies, such as cheese. Over time, they learned how to make it last longer, so by the 18th century, cheese became part of sailors' diets. They also made various kinds of stews in the Navy, with salted meat still being the main ingredient. When food supplies on the ship ran really low, sailors were given potage. It was a hellish brew made from almost anything they could find. Leftover rotten salted meat, bones, wormy hardtack, and sometimes even leather belts and boots. The mixture was boiled in a cauldron, then given to the starving sailors. The usual source of fresh meat was ship rats. They reproduced so quickly in the holds that soon they were running not only through the cabins and beds, but even over the people themselves. When normal food ran out, a real rat hunt would begin on the ship. The most skilled hunters even sold the court's rodents to their comrades. Yes, this might horrify a modern person, but it should be understood that hunger was a constant companion of sailors in the age of sail, and it was so severe that sometimes it even led to cannibalism. After that, any rotten salted meat seems like a delicacy. What did they drink in the Navy? The Sailing Navy's second issue was fresh water. In wooden barrels, it quickly went bad and became a breeding ground for all sorts of bacteria. Adding vinegar, wine, filtering, or using special types of wood for barrels helped little, so sailors often had to drink cloudy, foul-smelling liquid. The issue was so urgent that in the mid-16th century, English Queen Elizabeth I promised a huge reward for a way to desalinate seawater, but it was never paid out. No one was able to come up with an effective method. The problem with drinking water was only solved in the 19th century with the advent of galvanized tanks for its storage. Alcohol, a regular part of their diet, kept sailors from losing their minds in harsh service conditions. In addition, alcohol served as a disinfectant, at least somewhat reducing the harm from stale water and spoiled food. Everyone in the Navy drank beer, gin, wine, vodka, and of course rum, which first appeared in the British Navy in the mid-17th century. Every Englishman. About 0.286 liters. It should be noted that naval rum had a strength of 60 to 80 degrees. Strong alcohol, of course, saved sailors from dysentery, but it also had serious drawbacks. It undermined discipline on the ship, led to fights and stabbings, and increased injuries and mortality due to alcoholism and related diseases. Therefore, since the mid-18th century, the alcohol content in naval fleets began to be reduced. For example, in the Royal Navy, grog appeared, an alcoholic cocktail that contained 1/3 rum, 2/3 water, lemon juice, and spices. The sailors liked the drink, but the stewards and integrants constantly profited from its preparation by simply not adding enough rum to the cocktail. The body of Britain's national hero, Admiral Nelson, was brought home in a barrel of brandy. Thanks to this, it was perfectly preserved. However, they had to post guards around the barrel because many sailors tried to taste such an unusual infusion. When the body arrived in Britain, a scandal broke out. The organizers of the transportation were accused of lacking patriotism, since brandy was considered a French drink. Like, didn't you have any rum? A peasant farm under sail. If you accidentally ended up on an 18th century ship, you would probably mistake it for Noah's Ark. At that time, every ship setting out on a long voyage resembled a real zoo, or rather, a peasant farm. Storing food was difficult back then, so they brought it along alive. On board, you could find geese, ducks, goats, pigs, rabbits, and even calves. Gradually, all these animals were turned into cutlets, roasts, or patties, which of course were served first at the officers' table. Moreover, sometimes real herds with impressive numbers of animals were kept on the ships. For example, in 1760-71 calves were loaded onto the 64-gun Somerset to feed the squadron. Birds and small animals were kept in cages, but goats, pigs, and calves roamed freely around the ship. Just imagine what its deck looked like. But before battles, this entire zoo was mercilessly thrown overboard. The toilet on a sailing ship. The toilet on a ship is called the head, and in the age of sail, it wasn't so simple either. It was located at the bow of the ship, right under the bowsprit, a wooden beam used for installing certain elements of the sailing rig. The sailor's head was an open flat platform with a hole, surrounded by thin railings or ropes, from which an inattentive sailor could easily be washed away by a wave. Falling overboard in the open sea meant certain death. That's why sailors didn't like using the head and tried to find a secluded spot somewhere in the hold. Violators were fined and even flogged, but it didn't help much. The officer's head, located at the stern of the ship, was much more comfortable and safer. It was an enclosed cabin, so a person no longer risked falling into the sea. A safe toilet was a significant privilege for officers on a sailing ship. What illnesses did sailors suffer from? Diseases were the main cause of high mortality in the sailing fleet. This was due not only to the terrible conditions of life on board, but also to the backwardness of medicine at that time. Sailors suffered from scurvy fever, typhus, plague, cholera, dysentery, malaria, and tuberculosis. Their work caused many illnesses. On a sailing ship, for example, the skin on the hands of the topmen would crack. Signalmen would develop conjunctivitis, gunners would suffer from progressive deafness, and helmsmen would experience contraction of the palmar fascia. Sailors of all specialties, without exception, suffered from gastrointestinal disorders caused by poor and monotonous nutrition. Because of unsanitary conditions, any wound could become infected and threaten a person's life. However, the most terrible enemy of sailors in the sailing fleet was, of course, scurvy. It was scurvy that claimed 3/4 of sailors' lives in the 15th to 19th centuries. At first, the patient would feel weakness, apathy, chest and lower back pain. Then their gums would start to bleed, blood would come from the eyes and nose, and ulcers would appear on the body. In the final stages of the disease, a person would literally rot alive, emitting a disgusting corpse-like stench, the smell. To help you understand the scale of the problem, I'll give you just one example. In 1740, the squadron of British Admiral George Anson set sail for the shores of South America. He commanded about 2,000 sailors, but after 5 years, only 500 returned home. Most of the others died from scurvy. But worst of all, no one understood what caused this disease or why some people died from it while others did not. For example, there was a theory that scurvy was caused by sailors' homesickness. It was recommended to take soil from the homeland on the voyage in small bags and sprinkle it on the sick person at the first signs of illness. Another version claims scurvy was caused by blood stagnation, so patients were given cannonballs to hold while running around the deck or underwent bloodletting. In the 16th century, it became clear that the main cause of scurvy was the monotonous diet of sailors, specifically the lack of vegetables and fruits. Whenever possible, sailors were given citrus fruits, oranges, and lemons, which solved the problem. However, scurvy was only completely defeated in the Navy by the 19th century. Since 1797, oranges and lemons were officially included in the diet of British sailors, and to preserve the lemons better, they were pickled. Later, lemon juice was added to rum and grog, which preserved vitamin C very well. And of course, sailors gladly took such medicine. Punishment in the sailing fleet. A sailing ship was truly a harsh place. In addition to terrible conditions and hard labor, there was a sophisticated system of punishments here that threatened a sailor for any, even the slightest, misconduct. For minor mistakes, sailors were fined. The offender was hit in the pocket. A common punishment was solitary confinement, where the offender was put on bread and water. Often, they would also be searched, and they were shackled in irons. However, most often on sailing ships, punishment was carried out with a whip. On the British fleet, for example, they favored the cat o' nine tails, a special whip that left terrible wounds. 10 lashes were considered the minimum punishment. For more serious offenses, they could give 70 lashes or even 100. Not everyone survives such punishments. Therefore, in 1844, the British Admiralty forbade giving sailors more than 48 lashes. Another common punishment was keel hauling. The essence of it was that the offending sailor was pulled under the bottom of the ship using pulleys and ropes, where open shells would tear his body. If the ropes got stuck for some reason, the punished person faced certain death. A sailor who had misbehaved could be dunked into the ocean after being tied to a log or made to gaze at the sky. Behind such a romantic name was a punishment where a sailor was tied in a special way to the top of the mast and left there for several hours. The punishments described were given for relatively minor offenses like being late for watch, leaving your post, or getting into a fight. For more serious offenses like mutiny, rebellion, or attacking an officer, the sailor faced death. Sailors in the Navy were usually hanged, and it was common to see multiple bodies hanging from the ship's yards. Same-sex love in the sailing Navy. But what about bestiality, which Winston Churchill talked about? There are different opinions on this matter. For example, Roger, in his book Wooden World, The Anatomy of the Georgian Navy, claims that cases of same-sex love were rare on sailing ships. Moreover, he bases this on 18th century court cases. There are two important points in favor of this point of view. First, according to the naval regulations of that time, a sailor caught in relations with another man or an animal would inevitably face the death penalty. And second, superstitious sailors believed that because of a sodomite, God might punish them by sinking the ship. Thus, someone in these situations could be thrown overboard by crewmates without trial or investigation. Other researchers believe that cases of same-sex love among sailors did happen, but they were not widely publicized. At that time, the laws held that they brought shame to not just the ship, but the entire fleet. At that time, homosexuality was indeed considered a grave sin. Winston Churchill, who served as First Lord of the Admiralty for several years, probably knew a bit more about this issue. In conclusion, the real-life and everyday existence of sailors in the sailing fleet was nothing like the images from adventure novels. Not at all. There's a saying in the Navy. In the past, ships were made of wood and sailors were made of iron. Now ships are made of iron and sailors are made of wood. When you read an actual document from that era, you can't help but admire the courage of the people who, in absolutely terrible conditions, conquered the oceans and opened up the world for us. In general, we should take our hats off to our ancestors. Most modern people are just a pale shadow of them, whining about any inconvenience. Well, damn, where are you, damn it? Okay, that's enough. Stop it.